The sun was a merciless brass gong in a bleached white sky. Heat shimmered off the sand in dizzying waves, making the distant mountains waver like mirages. Sergeant Eva Rostova wiped a grimy sleeve across her forehead, her skin gritty with a fine layer of dust that coated everything. It was in your teeth, your eyes, the folds of your uniform. Her team, call sign Anvil, was strung out along the wadi, a dry riverbed that offered the only semblance of cover in this vast, empty landscape. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the low hum of the lead Humvee's engine. It was a silence that felt wrong. Her second-in-command, Corporal Miller, shifted his weight beside her, the webbing of his gear creaking. "Too quiet, Sarge," he muttered, his eyes constantly scanning the barren ridges. "Intel said this sector was clear." "Intel has been wrong before," Eva replied, her voice low. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sky met the land in a searing line. She had learned to trust her instincts long before any satellite report. Her father's words from a lifetime ago in a different, colder world echoed in her mind. "The land always speaks, Yevgenia. You must only learn to listen." Right now, the land was screaming. The radio on her shoulder crackled to life. "Anvil Actual, this is Watchtower. Be advised, we are detecting significant movement on your flank. Multiple contacts, over." Eva's blood went cold. She keyed her mic, her voice betraying none of the sudden chill. "Watchtower, Anvil Actual. Confirm type and numbers, over." The pause that followed was agonizing. Then, the voice returned, strained. "Visual confirmation shows 2 technicals and 1 BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle, bearing down on your position. Estimate 5 minutes. You are advised to disengage. Over." A BMP. The word landed like a physical blow. They had small arms, a couple of machine guns, nothing that could scratch the hide of a tracked armored vehicle. Miller's face paled beneath his tan. "They've got a BMP. We're not equipped for that." Eva's mind was already racing, a chessboard of tactics and terrain unfolding behind her eyes. The wadi was a death trap. The BMP could roll right down on them. They needed high ground. "Disengage isn't an option," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We'd be cut to pieces in the open. Miller, get the Javelin team up on that northern ridge. Chen, I want the medkit ready and accessible. Everyone else, defensive positions, now!" The team exploded into motion, a well-oiled machine responding to a critical failure. Soldiers scrambled up the sides of the wadi, seeking whatever cover the rocks could provide. The Javelin team, 2 young soldiers whose names flashed through Eva's mind, Parker and Jessup, hauled their heavy launch unit towards the higher ground. The air, once heavy with silence, was now thick with the sounds of frantic preparation. The clatter of magazines being checked, the thud of bodies hitting the dirt. The tense, sharp breaths of men and women preparing to fight for their lives. Eva climbed to a vantage point, raising her binoculars. Her heart sank. On the horizon, a dust cloud was growing, a brown smudge against the pale blue. And there, in the heart of it, was the unmistakable low-slung silhouette of the BMP. It was moving fast. They had less than 5 minutes. She looked back at her team. Private Chen was helping Jessup with the Javelin's command launch unit, his face a mask of determination. Miller was directing fire teams, his voice steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. These were her people, her responsibility. A memory, sharp and clear, cut through the adrenaline. Her father, pointing to a complex chessboard. "When you are outnumbered, Yevgenia, you must change the game. You must introduce a new piece." They had no new pieces. The Javelin was their only hope. She keyed her mic again. "Parker Jessup, that BMP is your only priority. You get 1 shot. Make it count." "Copy that, Anvil Actual." Parker's voice came back, tight with focus. The waiting was the worst part. The dust cloud grew larger. The low rumble of the vehicles became a growl, then a roar. Eva could make out the shapes of the technicals now, men standing in the backs, clinging to mounted machine guns. And the BMP, its cannon swiveling hunting. It was a sound of pure mechanical menace. The first, distant pop, pop, pop of Kalashnikovs reached them, the rounds whining harmlessly overhead. They were testing the range. The storm was about to break. Ava took a deep breath, the dry air scraping her throat. The equation was simple, brutal. They were outnumbered, and they were outgunned. She tightened her grip on her rifle. The game had begun. The first cannon round from the BMP tore into the wadi with the sound of the world ending. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a demolition. Sand, rock, and shrapnel erupted in a geyser 50 meters to their left. The concussion hit Ava like a physical wall, pressing her flak jacket into her ribs and ringing her ears with a high-pitched whine. "Incoming!" someone screamed, the voice thin and distant against the roar. The two technicals swerved, fanning out like hunting dogs, their machine guns opening up with a brutal, chattering rhythm. Tracers streaked across the wadi, stitching lines of fire through the air, seeking flesh. Ava pressed herself into the hard-packed earth, the heat of the sand seeping through her uniform. "Return fire! Suppress those technicals!" she yelled into the radio, her own voice alien to her. The ridge erupted with the disciplined crack of M4s. Her team was good, professional. They aimed, fired short bursts, and shifted position. One of the technicals swerved violently as its windshield spiderwebbed, the gunner ducking down. A small victory. It wouldn't last. Her eyes snapped back to the BMP. It was a dinosaur, a hulking beast of green steel, grinding relentlessly forward. Its coaxial machine gun joined the fray, hosing down their positions with a torrent of fire that chewed up the landscape. "Parker, Jessup, take the shot! Take it now!" she barked into the mic, a moment of silence. Then, Parker's voice, strained and frantic. "CLU is down! The command launch unit is fried! We've got nothing!" The bottom dropped out of Ava's stomach. The Javelin, their one equalizer, was a 70-pound paperweight. The equation had just gotten infinitely worse. They were not just outgunned, they were defenseless against that armor. The BMP's cannon fired again. This one was closer. The blast threw one of her men, Rodriguez, backward like a rag doll. He didn't get up. Private Chen was moving instantly, low and fast, dragging his med kit through the dust towards the fallen soldier. They needed a miracle. They needed a new piece on the board. Her father's voice, calm and analytical, cut through the panic in her mind. "When your king is threatened, Yevgenia, you do not surrender. You find another way to checkmate. What tools do you have that your opponent has forgotten?" The Humvee, the battered, up-armored Humvee parked at the base of the wadi. Standard loadout. And in the standard loadout was... Her mind raced, picturing the inventory sheet. One M141 bunker defeat munition. A disposable shoulder-fired rocket. It was for static defenses, not a moving tank. It was a desperate tool. But it was a tool. Miller. "I need covering fire! Everything you've got! Make that BMP's gunner keep his head down! On it, Sarge!" Miller's response was immediate. He rallied the fire team, their rate of fire intensifying. A storm of bullets pinging harmlessly off the BMP's frontal armor but forcing the vehicle to momentarily slow, its vision slits and optics under duress. Eva didn't wait. She pushed herself up from the dirt and broke into a low, sprinting crouch. The world narrowed to the 20 meters between her and the Humvee. Rounds kicked up the sand at her heels. The zip of a passing bullet sounded like an angry insect by her ear. She didn't hear it. She only saw the rear of the vehicle. She slammed into the hot metal of the Humvee, gasping for air. The keys were in it, a contingency for a quick escape. Her hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the rear latch. It sprung open. There, strapped to the interior, was the long, green fiberglass tube. The M141, she ripped it from its brackets. It was lighter than the Javelin, but in her hands, it felt like the weight of all their lives. She dropped to one knee, hefting the tube onto her shoulder. Her thumb found the safety switch, flipping it forward. The simple iron sights were up. She peered over them. The BMP was a blur through the heat haze and dust, maybe 200 meters out and still advancing. It was an impossible shot for this weapon, a lottery ticket, but it was the only ticket they had. She took a deep, settling breath, the sounds of the battle fading into a dull roar. Her finger found the trigger. The beast was in her sights. The world dissolved into a single, terrifying point of focus. The BMP's hull was a shifting green monster in her sights, made hazy by the heat and the swirling dust kicked up by its own tracks. Ava's arms trembled, not from fear, but from the strain of holding the heavy tube steady. 200 meters. at the edge of the M141's effective range, against a moving target. The math was bleak. A storm of machine gun fire from Miller's team peppered the BMP's front, a desperate attempt to blind it. Tracers ricocheted off the sloped armor in brilliant, fleeting sparks. She saw the vehicle's main cannon begin to traverse, searching for the source of the annoyance. It was now or never. Her father's voice was a whisper from the past, from a snowy forest outside Moscow. "Do not aim at the target, Yevgenia. Aim at where it will be. A leader anticipates." She led the vehicle, aiming a full length ahead of its grinding path. She exhaled, emptying her lungs, and her finger took up the slack on the trigger. The world exploded behind her. The backblast was a volcanic roar, a searing wave of heat and overpressure that scorched the earth behind the Humvee. The rocket shot away with a deafening shriek, a red-tailed comet streaking across the wadi. Time seemed to stretch, to bend. Eva watched the fiery dart, her heart a frozen hammer in her chest. It missed. The rocket passed mere feet in front of the BMP's bow, exploding against a rock outcrop in a flash of fire and shattered stone. A miss. A gut-wrenching, soul-crushing miss. For a fraction of a second, despair threatened to swallow her whole. But then she saw it. The BMP's driver, startled by the sudden explosion directly in his path, instinctively wrenched his steering controls. The heavy vehicle lurched violently to the right, its tracks digging into the soft sand on the edge of the wadi. It was a fatal error. The ground gave way. The BMP's front end dipped sharply, then its entire left side sank, throwing up a huge plume of dust. The vehicle listed, its track spinning uselessly in the air. It was stuck, immobilized, its cannon now pointing harmlessly at the sky. It was no longer a hunter. It was a wounded animal, trapped. A ragged cheer went up from her team, but Eva was already moving. "Focus fire! The technicals!" she screamed, her voice raw. The enemy gunners, momentarily stunned by the sudden disablement of their armor, were slow to react. It was all the opening her team needed. The disciplined fire from the ridge found its mark. One technical's engine block was shredded, steam and smoke pouring from the hood. The other, seeing its primary weapon neutralized and its support failing, began a frantic, retreating turn. The tide had turned. Eva dropped the smoking, empty rocket tube. It clattered to the ground, its purpose spent. She unslung her M4, her body thrumming with adrenaline and a profound, bone-deep relief. She moved forward, joining her team as they advanced, mopping up the remaining resistance. The few militiamen on foot, seeing their vehicles destroyed or fleeing, dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The firing stopped. An eerie, ringing silence descended, broken only by the crackle of flames from the damaged technical and the low, pained groan of the trapped BMP. The sandstorm, which had held its breath during the fight, began to slowly abate, the winds dying down to a whisper. Eva's legs felt weak. She looked around at her team. Miller was clapping a young private on the back. Chen was still kneeling next to Rodriguez, now applying a pressure bandage, but he gave her a thumbs up. They were alive. They were all alive. She walked towards the edge of the wadi and looked down at the immobilized BMP. It looked pathetic now, a beached metal whale. She had not destroyed it with a brilliant shot. She had outmaneuvered it. She had changed the game. The odds, once so terribly stacked against them, were now even. The cost had been high, the margin for error non-existent, but they had held the anvil, and she had been the hammer. The silence after the battle was a heavy, living thing. It was filled with the ragged sound of her own breathing, the distant crackle of burning fuel, and the low, pained moan of the wounded. The adrenaline that had been a fire in her veins was now a cold, trembling ash in her limbs. Eva stood for a long moment staring at the empty rocket tube lying in the sand. It was just a piece of fiberglass now, useless. But a moment ago, it had held the power of life and death. "Medic! I need a hand with Rodriguez!" Chen's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and professional, but with an undercurrent of urgency that pulled Eva from her daze. She turned and moved towards them, her boots scuffing through the churned-up earth. Rodriguez was conscious, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his leg wrapped in a bloody bandage. "Hey, Sarge," he managed, his voice tight. You really showed that tin can, huh? Ava knelt, placing a hand on his shoulder. Just lie still, Rodriguez. You're going to be fine. She looked at Chen, who gave a slight, grim nod. It was bad, but it wasn't fatal. Not if they got him out of here soon. Miller approached, his face smudged with soot and dust. Casualty report. Rodriguez has a leg wound from shrapnel. Jessup took a round in the arm, but it's clean. Through and through. Everyone else is shaken up but mobile. He paused, looking at the smoking hulk of the technical and the trapped BMP. We got lucky. Sarge? Damn lucky. It wasn't luck, Corporal, Eva said, her voice low. It was you. It was all of you. You gave me the opening I needed. She looked around at her team. They were checking their gear, helping the wounded, their movements slow with the exhaustion that follows a fight. They were more than a team. They were a family bound by the shared knowledge that they had just stared into the abyss together. Her radio crackled. Anvil Actual, this is Watchtower. We lost your comms for a bit. What is your status? Over. Ava keyed the mic, her voice steadying as she slipped back into the role of commander. Watchtower, Anvil Actual. Contact is neutralized. One enemy BMP immobilized, 2 technicals destroyed. We have 2 wounded, priority 3. Requesting immediate medevac and extraction from our position. Over. Copy that, Anvil Actual. Medevac birds are already spinning up. ETA 20 minutes. Good work down there. Watchtower out. 20 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. The immediate threat was over, but the vulnerability remained. They were still deep in hostile territory. Miller, set up a perimeter. I want eyes on every approach. The noise will have drawn attention. You got it, Sarge. As Miller barked orders, Eva walked a slow circuit around their makeshift defensive position. She checked on Jessup, who was trying to light a cigarette with his good hand, his movements clumsy. She helped him, shielding the flame from the wind. Thanks, Sarge, he mumbled, taking a long, shaky drag. Thank you, soldier, she replied. You held your ground. She stopped by the Humvee, leaning against its hot, scarred side. The image of the rocket missing, of it flying harmlessly past the BMP, flashed in her mind. For a heart-stopping second, she had believed she had failed them. She had felt the weight of their lives about to be crushed because of her mistake. But her father's lessons had been deeper than just marksmanship. They were about psychology, about pressure. She hadn't needed to hit the vehicle. She only needed to make the driver flinch. She had turned his own fear into her weapon. In the distance, she could finally hear the faint, welcome thrum of approaching helicopters. The sound was a promise of safety, of home. She looked at her team, battered but unbroken, and a profound sense of pride swelled in her chest, pushing aside the last remnants of fear. They had been tested in fire and sand, and they had held. She had led them through it. The ledger for today was balanced. The rhythmic thrum of the Black Hawk helicopters was the most beautiful sound Eva had ever heard. It started as a faint vibration in the air, a promise on the wind, and grew into a powerful, steady beat that seemed to shake the very sand beneath their feet. Eyes on the skies! Miller yelled, his voice hoarse but energized. Let's get our boys ready to move. The next minutes were a controlled frenzy. Chen and another soldier carefully loaded Rodriguez onto a stretcher, his face tight with pain, but his eyes clear. Jessup, his arm in a proper sling now, helped gather their gear, his movements clumsy but determined. The exhaustion was still there, etched on every face, but it was now overshadowed by a palpable lifting relief. They were getting out. Eva kept her position, her M4 held ready as she scanned the barren horizon. The euphoria of survival was a dangerous distraction. The enemy that had fled could be regrouping, or another curious party could be drawn by the smoke and the sounds of battle. Her father had always cautioned against lowering your guard at the moment of victory. The last mile is often the most dangerous, Yevgenia. Complacency is the enemy's final ally. The 2 Blackhawks descended in a storm of their own making, rotors whipping the sand into a stinging, blinding fog. Eva squinted, shielding her eyes with her hand as the wheels touched down. The crew chiefs, silhouetted in the open doorways, waved them forward. Go, go, go! Miller directed, ushering the team towards the waiting birds. The wounded were loaded first, the stretcher handed up carefully into the strong hands of the medics inside. The rest of the team filed in after, their movements quick and practiced, slamming into the webbed seats along the fuselage. Eva took one last look around the wadi. It was a scar on the landscape now, littered with spent shell casings, blackened earth, and the wreckage of the battle. The trapped BMP sat silently, a monument to their desperation and her gamble. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had knelt here, aiming a disposable rocket at that beast. She turned and ran, ducking low under the spinning rotors, and hauled herself into the helicopter. The crew chief gave her a thumbs up and slid the door shut, plunging them into a dim, noisy cabin. The engine's pitch rose to a scream, and the helicopter lifted off, its nose dipping forward as it gained speed and altitude. Eva leaned back against the vibrating fuselage, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to uncoil. She looked across at her team. Rodriguez was being tended to by a flight medic. Jessup had his head back, his eyes closed. Miller was just staring out the window, a blank 1,000-yard look on his face. They were safe. One of the crew chiefs handed her a bottle of water. She took it with a nod, the plastic cool in her suddenly trembling hands. She unscrewed the cap and drank, the water tasting purer than anything she could remember. It washed the dust and the taste of cordite from her throat. The flight was a blur of brown landscape rushing beneath them. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a deep, hollowed-out fatigue. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to simply exist in the noise and the vibration, to feel the reality of being airborne, of being away from the kill zone. There would be debriefings, reports, and questions. There would be the long process of recovery for Rodriguez and Jessup. But for now, in this moment, there was only the steady thrum of the rotors and the profound, unshakable knowledge that they had survived. She had brought them home. The mission was over. The return to the forward operating base was a jarring transition from the raw, life-and-death reality of the wadi to the structured, buzzing hive of the military outpost. The Black Hawk settled onto the dust-choked landing pad with a final, shuddering sigh of its engines. As the rotors whined down, the world outside became audible again, the distant rumble of generators, the shouted instructions from a nearby motor pool, the mundane sounds of a world that had not been fighting for its life just an hour before. The cabin door slid open, flooding the dim interior with harsh midday light. Medics and corpsmen were waiting, their faces professionally neutral. They efficiently offloaded Rodriguez and Jessup, transferring them onto gurneys and wheeling them briskly toward the base hospital. The rest of the team disembarked more slowly, their movements stiff, their gear seeming to weigh twice as much as it had before. They were ghosts returning to the land of the living, covered in grime and the lingering scent of smoke and sweat. Eva was the last to step out, her boots hitting the sun-baked concrete of the pad. The heat was the same, but it felt different here. It was just weather, not an element of a battlefield. A senior NCO, a master sergeant with a graying regulation haircut and a face like worn leather, approached her. He didn't offer a handshake or a smile. He simply looked at her, his eyes taking in her disheveled state. The dust caked on her face, the hollow look in her own eyes. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Get your team squared away. Debriefing is at 1600 hours in conference room 2. His gaze held hers for a moment longer, and in that look, she saw something more than an order. It was an acknowledgement. A silent understanding passed between them. A language spoken only by those who had commanded in the chaos and brought people back. He gave a single, slow nod. "Good work out there." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Eva standing there. The words were simple, almost clinical, but they landed with the weight of a medal. It was the only recognition that truly mattered, coming from another who knew the cost. She found her team gathered near the barracks, a loose, quiet circle. They were mechanically unpacking their gear, cleaning weapons, going through the rituals that helped ground a soldier after a fight. Miller looked up as she approached. "Rodriguez is in surgery. They say he'll keep the leg. Jessup is getting patched up. He'll be fine." A collective, almost imperceptible sigh of relief passed through the group. The final lingering fear for their comrades had been put to rest. They were all going to make it. Eva stood before them, her team, her family. They looked at her, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a newfound, unshakable respect. She didn't give a speech. There were no grand words. She simply looked at each of them in turn, Miller, Chen, and all the others whose lives had been in her hands. "Get some chow," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Get some rest. You've earned it." She turned and walked towards her own quarters. The corridor was dim and quiet. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, the Spartan room feeling both alien and sanctuary. She leaned her rifle against the wall by the door, its familiar weight a comfort. She unbuckled her body armor, letting the heavy plates fall to the floor with a dull thud. Then she sat on the edge of her cot, her elbows on her knees, and finally let the silence claim her. The images of the day played across her mind, the advancing BMP, the missed rocket, the desperate hope of her team. She had not been a hero. She had been a leader, a calculator of odds, a soldier who refused to lose. And in the quiet of the room, that felt like enough. The debriefing room was cold, sterile, and smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. A large map of the region was projected onto a screen, a red circle marking the wadi where their lives had almost ended. Ava sat upright in a hard plastic chair, facing a major and a captain from intelligence. For over an hour, she had walked them through it, her voice a flat, steady recitation of facts. The initial contact, the identification of the BMP, the failure of the Javelin system, her decision to use the M141. "So, to be perfectly clear, Sergeant," the major said, steepling his fingers. "You engaged a BMP-1, a armored fighting vehicle, with a bunker defeat munition at approximately 200 meters, while under heavy fire." "Yes, sir," Ava replied, her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. "And your initial shot missed its target." "That is correct, sir. It impacted directly in front of the vehicle, causing the driver to swerve and become immobilized in the soft sand of the wadi." The captain leaned forward, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "The M141 is not designed for moving armor." "That was an inventive application, Sergeant." "A hell of a gamble?" Eva's eyes flicked to his. "It was the only tool available, sir. The tactical situation required a change in the enemy's calculus. Immobilizing the vehicle achieved the same strategic effect as destroying it. It neutralized the primary threat." The two officers exchanged a look. The major made a note on his pad. The recovery team confirmed the BMP was abandoned, operational but stuck. "Your actions and the fire discipline of your team prevented a catastrophic outcome." He closed his folder. "That will be all, Sergeant. You and your team are to stand down for the next 48 hours. Dismissed." Ava stood, saluted crisply, and left the room. The hallway outside was warm and quiet. The formalities were over. The Army had its report. But as she walked back toward the barracks, the weight of the debriefing settled on her. They had used words like inventive and gamble. They made it sound like a roll of the dice, a desperate fluke. They hadn't been there. They hadn't felt the pressure, seen the faces of her team, heard the grinding tracks of that metal beast. They didn't understand that it wasn't a gamble. It was a calculated decision made in the split second between life and death. She found herself outside the base hospital. The air inside was cool and smelled of antiseptic. She walked down the clean, brightly lit corridor until she found the right room. Rodriguez was propped up in his bed, his leg heavily bandaged and elevated. He was asleep, his face peaceful. In the chair next to him, using his good arm to hold a book, was Jessup. He looked up as she entered. "Sarge," he said, a tired smile touching his lips. "How is he?" Ava asked, her voice soft. "The docs say he'll be running again in a few months. Bitching the whole time, probably." Jessup closed his book. "They're shipping him to Landstuhl tomorrow." Ava nodded, looking at the sleeping soldier. He was alive. He was going home. That was the only report that mattered. "Hey, Sarge," Jessup said, his tone shifting. I saw it. From the ridge. I saw you take that shot." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Everyone's talking about it." "Saying you missed," Eva didn't respond. She just looked at him. Jessup's smile returned, wider this time. "I don't think you missed. I think you hit exactly what you were aiming for. You hit the driver's nerve." He went back to his book, and Ava stood there for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of Rodriguez's chest. The cold sterility of the debriefing room melted away, replaced by the warm, quiet truth of the hospital room. Jessup understood. Her team understood. They knew she hadn't just fired a rocket. She had fired a message, and the message had been received. She hadn't evened the odds with explosives alone. She had evened them with nerve. 2 days later, the 48-hour stand-down was over. The base was returning to its normal rhythm, a machine absorbing the shock of their engagement and moving on. Ava was in the motor pool, performing a routine inventory check on a new Humvee, the familiar scent of diesel and grease a grounding presence. The mundane task was a welcome anchor. She heard the crunch of boots on gravel behind her and turned. It was Miller, his uniform clean, the hollows under his eyes less pronounced. "Sarge," he said, his tone unreadable. "You're wanted at the CO's office, now." A cold knot tightened in Eva's stomach. The debriefing was over. A summons to the commanding officer's office could mean anything. A formal reprimand for the destroyed equipment, a deeper inquiry into her decision, or perhaps nothing at all. She nodded, wiping her hands on an oil rag. On my way. She walked across the compound, the sun warm on her back. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one more grim than the last. Had the gamble been too unorthodox? Had someone higher up decided her inventive solution was, in fact, a violation of protocol? She reached the headquarters building, a low, sand-colored structure, and announced herself to the clerk. She was shown in immediately. The room was spare, dominated by a large desk and the unit's colors standing in the corner. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, a man with a calm, measured demeanor, stood looking at a map on the wall. He turned as she entered. "Sergeant Rostova." "Stand at ease," he said, his voice even. Eva complied, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture rigid. She waited. The colonel studied her for a moment, his gaze appraising. "I've read the after-action report. I've also read the sworn statements from every member of your team. Corporal Miller's was particularly effusive." He picked up a small velvet-covered box from his desk. "The United States Army has a very specific set of criteria for awarding valor. It requires witnesses, evidence, and a clear demonstration of gallantry against an armed enemy." He opened the box. Inside, on a field of blue silk, was the Bronze Star Medal with a V device for valor. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "However," the colonel continued, closing the box with a soft click, "the bureaucracy that governs these things can be slow, mired in paperwork. It may be months before this is officially presented, if at all." He walked around the desk and held the box out to her. Eva stared at it, her mind struggling to catch up. This wasn't a reprimand. "The medal is for the record, Sergeant," the colonel said, his voice dropping, becoming more personal. "But this," he tapped the box, "this is from me, and from every man and woman in this command who understands what happened out there. You were given an anvil. You were handed a hopeless situation. And you did not break. You did not falter. You used your mind, your training, and a courage I see in very few, to save the lives of your soldiers. That is the job of a leader. You executed it flawlessly under fire." He pressed the box into her hands. Her fingers closed around the soft velvet, the weight of it surprisingly heavy. "There will be no ceremony today, Sergeant, but I wanted you to have this now. I wanted you to know, without a doubt, that your actions are recognized and honored by your command. Dismissed." Ava saluted, the motion automatic. She turned and walked out of the office, the box held tightly in her hand. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The weight of it, the colonel's words, were enough. She stepped back out into the blinding sun. Across the dusty parade ground, she saw her team. Miller, Chen, and the others, now cleaned and rested, were gathered watching her. They knew why she had been summoned. Miller met her eyes from across the distance and offered a slow, deliberate salute. One by one, the others followed. Eva stood still, the metal box in one hand. She didn't return the salute. Instead, she simply nodded. A deep, profound acknowledgement passed between them. The official recognition was a single gleaming moment. But the respect of the soldiers she had led out of hell, that was the true reward. That was the legacy that would endure long after the medal was tucked away in a drawer. The odds had been evened, not just on a battlefield, but in the hearts of those who had fought beside her. The ledger was closed.